was violated by the Russians. And if we don't push back on that, on those violations, then that will continue. And that, Mr. Chairman, affects us. It affects the world that we live in, that our children will grow up in, and our grandchildren. This affects the kind of world that we want to see abroad. So that affects our national interest very directly. Ukraine is on the front line of that conflict.
I want to thank you both for your decades of service to the country, and now recognize Mr. Goldman for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Taylor, on the heels of you discussing the importance of the security assistance to Ukraine, I want to go to the end of the timeline where you learned that security assistance was conditioned on Ukraine announcing the investigations that the president wanted. And in particular, on September 9th of this year, you texted Ambassador Sondland and Volker, and the text message should be on the screen in front of you. And if you could read what you wrote.
As I said on the phone, I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign.
What did you mean when you said you thought it was crazy?
Ms. Goldman, I meant that because of the importance of security assistance that we had just described and had a conversation with the chairman, because that was so important, that security assistance was so important for Ukraine as well as our own national interest, to withhold that assistance for no good reason other than help with the political campaign made no sense. It was counterproductive to all of what we had been trying to do. It was illogical. It could not be explained. It was crazy.
When you say all of what we were trying to do, what do you mean by we?
I mean that the United States was trying to support Ukraine as a frontline state against Russian attack. And again, the whole notion of a rules-based order was being threatened by the Russians in Ukraine. So our security assistance was designed to support Ukraine. That's it. It was not just the United States. It was all of our allies.
When you reference help with a political campaign in this text message, what did you mean?
I meant that the investigation of Burisma and the Bidens was clearly identified by Mr. Giuliani in public for months as a way to get information on the two Bidens.
And that investigation, at the very least, was mentioned by President Trump in the July 25th phone call with President Zelensky. Is that right?
As we now know, yes. Yes. On September 25th, that transcript was released.
Ambassador Taylor, in your decades of military service and diplomatic service representing the United States around the world, have you ever seen another example of foreign aid conditioned on the personal or political interests of the President of the United States?
No, Mr. Goldman, I've not.
Mr. Kent,
Ronald
that
Reagan
vital
wanted a pair of
military
shoes
assistance
once, I think,
was not the only thing that President Trump was withholding from Ukraine. What else was contingent on Ukraine initiating these investigations?
Well, as we've talked earlier today, the possibility of a White House meeting was being held contingent to an announcement.
How important to President Zelensky was a White House meeting?
New leaders, particularly countries that are trying to have good footing in the international arena, see a meeting with the U.S. President in the Oval Office at the White House as the ultimate sign of endorsement and support from the United States.
And President Zelensky was a relatively new president, is that right?
That's correct. He was elected on April 21st, and his government was formed after parliamentary elections in July.
Would a White House meeting for President Zelensky boost his legitimacy as a new president in Ukraine?
It would primarily boost his leverage to negotiate with Vladimir Putin about the Russian occupation of 7% of Ukrainian territory.
Mr. Kent, is pressuring Ukraine to conduct what I believe you've called political investigations a part of U.S. foreign policy to promote the rule of law in Ukraine and around the world?
It is not.
Is it in the national interest of the United States?
In my opinion, it is not.
Why not?
Because our policies, particularly in promoting the rule of law, are designed to help countries, and in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, that is overcoming the legacy of communism. In the communist system, in particular, the Prosecutor General Office was used to suppress and persecute citizens, not promote the rule of law. So in helping these countries reach their own aspirations to join the Western community of nations and live lives of dignity, helping them have the rule of law with strong institutions is the purpose of our policy.
So in other words, it is a purpose of our foreign policy to encourage foreign nations to refrain from conducting political investigations. Is that right?
Correct. And in fact, as a matter of policy, not of programming, we oftentimes raise our concerns, usually in private, with countries that we feel are engaged in selective political prosecution and persecution of their opponents.
Ambassador Taylor, now that we've established that you ultimately did understand that President Trump was withholding the security assistance and a White House meeting from Ukraine until they announced these investigations to benefit his re-election campaign, let's go back a little bit in time to when you first learned about this conditionality. And on September 1st, so a little more than a week before that text we just read, you sent another text to Ambassadors Sondland and Volker, which should also be on the screen in front of you. And if you could read what you wrote to them.
Are we now saying that security assistance and White House meeting are conditioned on investigations?
This is when
Ambassador Sondland
realizes
call me.
He's wearing a wire.
Now, what information
have
you learned that prompted you to write this text message?
I had learned that in Warsaw, after the meeting Vice President Pence had with President Zelensky, Ambassador Sondland had meetings there and had described to Mr. Yermak, the assistant to President Zelensky, that the security assistance was also held pending announcement by
everything held.
President Zelensky in public of these investigations. Before that, I had only understood from Ambassador Sondland that the White House meeting was conditioned. And at this time, after I heard of this conversation, it struck me, it was clear to me that security assistance was also being held.
You said previously that you were alarmed to learn this. Why were you alarmed?
It's one thing to try to leverage a meeting in the White House. It's another thing, I thought, to leverage security assistance to a country at war, dependent on both the security assistance and the demonstration of support. It was much more alarming. The White House meeting was one thing, security assistance was much more alarming.
Now, Ambassador Taylor, in your opening statement, you outlined a very detailed timeline. And in fact, we have a written copy here, and you included some phrases and words in quotations. Did you take notes of this conversation on September 1st with Ambassador Sondland?
I did.
And did you take notes related to most of the conversations, if not all of them, that you recited in your opening statement?
All of them, Mr. Goldman.
And what do those quotations that you include in your opening statement reflect?
They reflect my notes on the exact words that I heard on that call. So it was, if I put those in quotes, that meant that those are the words used on that phone call or in that conversation.
Did you review those notes before you drafted your opening statement and came here to testify?
I did.
Now, is that how, for example, you remember that Ambassador Sondland was on a train from Paris to London, during a call in July?
That's correct.
And you are aware, I presume, that the State Department has not provided those notes to the committee. Is that right?
I am aware.
So we don't have the benefit of reviewing them to ask you these questions.
Correct. I understand that they may be coming sooner or later.
Well, we would welcome that. You also testified earlier, Ambassador Sondland, or Ambassador Taylor, that President Trump had delegated some matters overseeing Ukraine policy to Ambassador Sondland, who is a big inaugural supporter of President Trump, even though Ukraine is not in his domain of the European Union. Is that right?
Several participants in the meeting in the Oval Office with President Trump, with the delegation to the inauguration of President Zelensky, told me of that conversation, and it was at that meeting, as I understand it from several participants, that President Trump asked the participants to work with Mr. Giuliani on Ukraine policy.
Did you come to understand that Ambassador Sondland had a direct line of communication into President Trump?
I did.
And you testified, or rather in that text message, Ambassador Sondland says to call him after you wrote that. Did you in fact call him?
I did.
And what did he say to you?
He said that I was wrong about President Trump's intent, that there was no quid pro quo.
Tell him no quid pro quo. But
did he say anything after that?
But
did he describe to you, I believe you said, I'll refresh your memory, that
Thank you.
He mentioned something in your opening statement. You said that he said that everything, I believe, and you had that in quotes, was actually contingent on the initiation of these investigations.
no quid pro quo.
What did he mean by
But
everything?
I need all that stuff
Ms. Goldman, what
for
he
them
meant
to
by
get their stuff.
everything, was the security assistance and the White House meeting.
And I believe you also testified that he said he had made a mistake in relaying a message to the Ukrainians. What was that mistake?
The mistake he told me was earlier he had told, presumably President Zelensky and Mr. Yermak, that what was necessary for the White House meeting was the pursuit of these investigations. And he said he recognized that that was a mistake. It was not just the White House meeting that was dependent on the investigations. He said it was now everything. It included the security assistance.
So it was not just the White House meeting, it was also the security assistance.
Yes, sir.
And so even though President Trump was saying repeatedly that there is no quid pro quo, Ambassador Sondland relayed to you that the facts of the matter were that the White House meeting and the security assistance were conditioned on the announcement of these investigations. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding.
Now, you reference a television interview and a desire for President Trump to put Zelensky in a public box, which you also have in quotes. Was that in your notes?
It was in my notes.
And what did you understand that to mean, to put Zelensky in a public box?
I understood that to mean that President Trump, through Ambassador Sondland, was asking for President Zelensky to very publicly commit to these investigations, that it was not sufficient to do this in private, that this needed to be a very public statement.
And did you understand why it was needed to be in public as opposed to a private confirmation?
I had no further information on that.
Now, during this time period in early September, did you come to understand that from your conversations with the Ukrainians or other individuals that Ukraine felt pressure to initiate these investigations because of the conditionality of the